Hello and welcome to the 83rd Synergia Forum, the 19th in our series of virtual forums. And the topic for discussion today is to assess the future of national currencies in a digital world. Has COVID pushed digital currencies further? Is that an inevitable future that we are looking at? And then what happens to the national currencies, whether it is the dollar, ruble or the rupee? That's the future we are going to try and assess, and how this could potentially change monetary mechanisms and how it could even spin off a conflict between governments and private entities who tend to control digital currencies. And as always, to assess and give us their insights, the best minds in the world and from India joining us here at this virtual forum, starting with Mr. Michael Casey, author, journalist, a man who's at the cutting edge of innovation in terms of digital currencies, as Chief Content Officer of CoinDesk and an advisor to the Media Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you so much, Michael Casey, for joining us.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you very much for having me.
And from India, we have a veteran banker, a man who's seen the top of Indian banking, both as and the top management of the Mammoth State Bank of India, and is currently director at ICICI Bank. And he will tell us how banks in India and perhaps around the world are viewing digital currencies. Thank you so much, Mr. B. Sriram, for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure, Veera Raghav. It's a pleasure to join you.
And to understand how a bureaucrat thinks about it, we have a former bureaucrat and an academic right now, Dr. K.P. Krishnan, who joins us to give us an insight into how governments can view digital currencies and the future, the way forward in terms of how they would allow, potentially give us insights into how they would potentially look at relaxing restrictions or accepting digital currencies. Thank you so much, Mr. Krishnan, for joining us.
Thank you, Veera Raghav. It's a pleasure to be here.
And of course, we have the Chief Strategic Officer of Synergia Foundation, Major General Moni Chandi, President and Founder of the Synergia Foundation, Mr. Toby Simon, and Chief Operating Officer of the Synergia Foundation, Samrata Shetty, joining us this evening. They will weigh in with their insights, observations and questions. And of course, Toby Simon, the man who tries to make all this happen, he will weigh in with his final comments as well, as always, in the Synergia Virtual Forum. So without taking any further time, may I invite Mr. Michael Casey to give his opening remarks, and we will have a format where each speaker will give their opening remarks followed by a discussion that we will take forward. Mr. Casey, please lead the way into a digital world in terms of currencies for us at this forum.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to suggest, and I'm a little biased, that this is possibly the most exciting time to be in the world of money and finance. And I say that from the perspective of a journalist. Most of my life I was a journalist. I don't think there's anything more interesting than the future of money. On the other hand, it's also kind of terrifying and exciting. We are moving into, I think, a much more uncertain world, one that creates many opportunities, but also many challenges. And I think the emergence of COVID-19 as this threat has accelerated a process that was already starting to emerge with the convergence of, I would say, geopolitical tensions with technology, and those two forces together are driving this change. We're talking about this in a digital context, of course, and we always talk about digital currencies, and I just want to sort of establish a kind of a baseline of thinking here, and that is that when we're talking about digital currency, it needs to be distinguished from what we might call digital money, and the assumption sometimes is that the emergence of whether it's Bitcoin or central bank digital currencies or the various Libra from Facebook is that really it's not that much different from, say, old origins, which is cash. So the key point here is the absence of an intermediary between the peers, anybody, a payer and a payee, in that process. So the idea of a digital currency is essentially a bearer instrument. It is like cash. It's that you and I can transfer this, and we do not need that transfer on the ledger to be verified by a single intermediary. In the digital sense, the one driven by Bitcoin, of course, this is as the sort of the early implementation of this is it's because the ledger itself, the record of transactions, is managed by a decentralized entity, a network of computers rather than a single entity. I think in the context of central banks, which are obviously now moving quite rapidly into the digital currency world, it is less a function of the fact that it is still a central entity that is controlling the ledger than the fact that it is this understanding with the user of the sovereign nature of that issuer, and therefore that this instrument that they are delivering with the technology that allows it to be treated as a scarce bearer instrument is one of it being a unique artifact, like a banknote. So we're now in a world where there is no intermediary, essentially, whether it through Bitcoin, CBDC, central bank digital currencies, or potentially through corporate currencies like Libra. And why does this matter? This matters because by removing the intermediary of the bank as essentially a gatekeeper, an entity that can say yes or no to transactions, we've now truly turned money into software. We have made it programmable. The big word in the digital currency world at the moment is this concept of programmable money. And programmable money really, really matters because now money, some of you will have heard the quip that Mark Andreessen, the famous Silicon Valley developer and entrepreneur, made, where he said software is eating the world. And his point is that it is the capacity of software to sort of accelerate our organizational and our processing capacity is transformative in the way that we form relationships and make transactions. So when money itself, the very core thing that we use to transfer value and to keep track of our exchanges, becomes programmable, it then becomes incredibly powerful. So the absence of a bank stepping in the middle means that, for example, on a supply chain, the minute that an importer makes a payment to an exporter, the pallet run by a digital device of its own can be instructed by the logic embedded into that software to do something. Rather than having to go through the process of settlement and all the risks that come with that, we now have this phenomenal programmable capacity. And I think this really matters because we have, for one, China. I think if you step back and look where I think this forum is going to go and look at this from a global perspective, China is at least from the central bank digital currency part of this, driving quite aggressively into this space. They have the digital currency electronic payment system, DCEP, and that's most importantly being integrated with a blockchain services network, which is a model that uses the blockchain, not only for money, but also for the recording of information and the management of Internet of Things devices. So we're thinking about a world now where there are machines that there's all these smart city initiatives across China, whereby these devices will control our world, and they themselves will be transferring money directly amongst themselves. This digital bearer instrument, this programmable form of money that can turn devices on or off. So there's a huge efficiency gain that will come from the idea of having money that behaves like this in an environment where devices and data are driven in this mass smart city, smart supply chain kind of world. The other area I think it's very, very important is in the nature of settling international trade. So, I just saw a story yesterday about how Russia and China are, aggressively moving to try to resolve bilateral payment. Of course, this matters because most of the world's trade settlement payments transfer themselves through the dollar, and the dollar is there as the world's reserve currency, not only for capital accumulation and for protecting assets and liabilities, but really initially, and I would say as the base layer of our Bretton Woods reserve currency system, the dollar is there to protect participants in international trade from the potential volatility that arises over the time span of a import and export contract. So if you have digital currency, I would argue that it is going to be possible to bypass that intermediation role for the dollar or for any reserve currency for that matter, because those currencies, now programmable, can talk to each other and essentially lock in a kind of an escrow arrangement over the period of that contract, such that neither party necessarily needs to face the risk because of the automaticity that's attached to it, whereby when the goods are transferred, the funds immediately transfer to the exporter in the currency, in their currency, and if they don't, they revert back to the importer in their currency. And that, to me, is groundbreaking and potentially sets up an entire sequence of events that really challenges the dollar. So we're doing this. This is all happening at a time where U.S. leadership in the world, the foundational layer upon which the dollar's hegemony of the world's reserve currency is built, is of course being challenged. And this is being challenged for some time. We have a president who is significantly more isolationist. But also, it's fair to say America's record with regards to this pandemic is absolutely abominable. And that in itself, I think, is calling into question global trust in US leadership. So if we combine that with this technological shift and the fact that China is not only experimenting with this currency internally, but now doing so externally, it has its 65-country Belt and Road program that it is working on. We really have a huge challenge to the dollar, which means that America's gatekeeping capacity, its ability to use its bank as a way to manage its interests and set sanctions and so forth, will be challenged because this digital currency allows for an essential bypassing of all of that. Now, what does that future look like, though? If there is no reserve currency, what is the actual alternative? Where do we go? I do not believe we are going to go from what happened the last time we had a global reserve currency shift and the British pound basically stepped down and the dollar stepped up. I don't think anybody believes that the renminbi could actually be an alternative to the whole world. I don't think there is anywhere near the level of trust in Chinese institutions to enable that. But I don't think the euro is ready, and I don't think the yen is ready. So what does it look like? And I think it's fair to say it is going to be a multi-currency world, a world of competition between currencies. And it will do so in a digital framework. These will digital currencies competing against each other. And individuals and businesses will essentially be able to choose. Now, obviously, jurisdictional issues will play a huge role in this, but the very fluidity of value transfer in that digital world means that it is a very different environment. The competition on those currencies is going to be very real. And that will be, from a market perspective, a kind of disciplining and, it will have a profound impact on the way that governments manage their monetary existence and how they act. Now, that competition will not only be between central bank digital currencies, but it will now be a choice between those state currencies, true decentralized currencies that have no entity other than a protocol that is managing its monetary policy, like Bitcoin, and corporate currencies like Libra. So we have a choice, and we have a choice as individuals that I think is going to come down to a very important question. It's one that is very, very relevant in the digital age, and that is, how much privacy do we think it is important to have inside our transactions and indeed in our money itself? And that is where I think the technology of Bitcoin, of others that are working kind of zero knowledge proofs and all sorts of cryptographic solutions to this are going to be very, very important. And I think that the role of the individual, the rights of the individual will play a role like never before. There is now an opportunity for people to make that choice. But of course, it could go the wrong way. We could end up with a panopticon. We could end up with a system that is entirely surveilled. And I see that as a scary scenario because I worry about the very sort of sovereignty of the human being if all we have is a system that monitors everything that we do in our transactions with each other. So that's where I'll leave it. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Very interesting. The first portion of your conversation and your suggestions were on how this seems inevitable and will perhaps change the way we look at currencies and monetary mechanisms. But the last part of it brings out the flip side to it as well, which is the question of trust and how we move forward. And I wonder if that is really the key issue from a banker's point of view, Mr. Sriram, that you think will play a role in determining how fast or how slowly we move towards a digital currency.
Thank you, Veera. And I think it was when Michael talked about removing the intermediary of the banks. I was just wondering, for 40 years I've been with banks, and where do I go tomorrow? Is something that struck me straight away. But that apart, let me just sort of organize my thoughts at three levels. In terms of try and present my case. One is, of course, the area as to why are we debating and discussing this so much today. The second is, what is the facilitating factors that requires for a change in the current order, or are there issues and things that we need to look at? And the third is, of course, the way forward in whatever way that we can think on a better currency world for all of us. So when you see the debate today is basically, whenever there is a crisis, it brings with it debates, opportunities, innovations, and generally a clamor for changing the status quo. This COVID-driven situation is no exception. And in that sense, I think in 2008 we had the same, and now again we are having the same. But on top of it, we have a lot of other issues which are bothering us, and it's part of the global scenario. One is, of course, the meltdown in the economy, possibility of or even inevitability of hyperinflation coming through, printing of trillions of dollars of money, massive increase in Fed balance sheet. 2007 is less than 1 trillion, and now we are talking about 7 trillion or so of G-Secs that are held by, and most of it, a large part of it by people from outside the US. Japan and China have a large holding there. A weakening dollar. Again, the problem is that when there is a flight to safety, generally the dollar strengthens. But here we have a contrarian, ironic view that the gold, the silver, and probably even some of these digital currencies are getting much stronger than the dollar. Index all-time low, in a crisis. Not all-time, about 2 years for the last 2 years. And even in India, for example, the RBI's balance sheet has grown by 10 trillion. And it has not gone into the economy. 50% of it has actually gone into building forex reserves. So in that context, is the whole build-up is due to a crisis, which is actually translated into a sort of a requirement to see whether the status quo needs to be changed. And thirdly, what is the best way forward in whatever way, what are the best alternatives that are there. The loss of confidence in the dollar has been there for some time, but the fact remains that 60% of reserves is still in dollars. Most of the trade and international trade happens in US dollars, and people seemingly are quite comfortable with it. And to get somebody to get a position of preeminence, which the euro and to some extent the Chinese yuan have been trying, is going to be slow, but definitely there. Is there an alternative to the US dollar? Will the economy collapse? If the US economy collapses, what happens to the reserves? What happens to the trade? I think these are all questions that weigh, and more so, as I said, when there is a crisis. The pandemic has actually affected both lives and livelihoods. It has hastened the search for alternatives. Problem is, during the pandemic, we always talk about laundering money. We don't say that cash can be washed. So you can't have a washed cash. You can have a laundered cash. The other opportunity in this whole debate is the opening up of the economy to the unbanked. There are again about 2.5 billion people who are unbanked. And is there a way in which seamlessly across the world you can have a new system which opens up the economy to these people without creating a formal banking structure, which is both costly and difficult. So that is something that is there, and the biggest sort of enabler in the first part is that all four major stakeholders, one is the regulators and the government, second is the implementers, which are the innovators, the change agents, third is the ultimate stakeholders, who are the consumers, and the fourth is the intermediaries, who are the institutions, are all looking to be positive in trying to figure out whether a digital currency is possible and what form is it possible. Now, whether it's in the form of a Bitcoin or in the form of a CBDC or is this a combination or something can always be debated. But largely the debate has gone through there. We have had 10 years of Bitcoin now, and we have more than around the same time of the blockchain. A lot of understanding from what it was as a technical jargons in some days to a large extent. Many of the jargons have been explained today, but that is how it is today. So I go back to the second part, which is what are the enablers which are there. One is, of course, the big change in the last 10 years, which has helped this, is the technology and the innovation on it. Now, even the Bitcoin, the blockchain settlement, which takes 10 minutes or so for every block to be settled, I think we have now a layer 2 coming up, which says that it is instantaneous, milliseconds, and so on and so forth. There are enough technology innovations across the whole gamut of processes and systems in the banking and financial space. So that is a very, very big enabler. And one of the things, again, enabling this is the large capital flows that are going towards innovation and technology. People are very much ready to burn money, to burn capital, to try and make sure that there is an alternative there. So that is one big advantage that we carry in terms of taking the alternate forward. The second is, of course, the issue of demographics. Now, a large part of the population is actually growing and or rather, starting with a technology which at least the people in our generation were not used to. So it's not a question of trying to adjust to technology, but it is getting birth with the technology and then taking it forward. That is a very big advantage today if you are to drive a certain currency or a technology forward. And the third is, of course, the supporting the shift in the monetary system, which goes from a centralized control to decentralized control. Now, clamor is, of course, after saying that when there is a crisis, somebody has to be blamed. And who's to blame is something that you can talk about regulators, government, or anybody else. But in a decentralized environment, the expectation, the perception is everyone is responsible, everyone is accountable, and therefore, everyone is to blame if there is a sort of a crisis of a monetary system. So we have a sort of a perceived good management that is probably coming up in terms of monetary policy and all. So that is something that is also facilitating. What is not facilitating is the development of the ecosystem. Affordability is a problem. Infrastructure, devices, and connectivity is an issue. Creation of a unique digital identity is a problem. Financial literacy, mass adoption is a problem. Consumer protection issues are a problem. And finally, the mindset, the comfort of cash. Even in developed countries like Japan and Germany, it's completely cash and the mindset is completely cash driven. So in that circumstance, the ecosystem needs to be developed, and that's where the problem comes in a very big way. The second is a perceived advantages. You can have advantages in your mind, but are they going to be transformed into something concrete on the ground? Right. Is still is an issue. How do we control something like I said, hyperinflation or capital controls using digital currency or using a Bitcoin? What are the cashless society benefits? We say that there are, fee income will come down, costs will come down, but does it continue to percolate to the last man standing? Exchange spreads will come down and so on and so forth. And the third part is, of course, the universal acceptance. There is a problem in terms of legal protection, customer suitability and appropriateness. People, even today, if you have a derivative transaction, still we talk about suitability of the transaction for a customer in terms of whether we should sell it or not, whether a customer understands the concept, the technology behind it, and then comes into it. All risks, when it goes into a digital currency, remains with the individual. It doesn't percolate to a government or to a regulator in many ways. So the rising risks of speculative dealings, the rising risk of other issues that can come purely because there is no trust or there is no universal acceptance on that. As regards the third aspect of way forward, I'll just take a minute, Veera. Right. Is the first. I think there is no doubt that we are going into a digitalized economy in the sense that what Michael said earlier. I don't think there is any doubt on that. Whether you go into digital currency is something that we have to wait and see. But digitalized economy is something that is there, and that probably will solve the medium of exchange issue, not the value for the value issue, but the medium of exchange. Somewhere along the line, I think many of the central banks are now toying with the CBDC. And for the first time, the Reserve Bank have also come out with a circular in terms of detailing what exactly is happening in the digital currency world. So I would imagine a CBDC without DLT, which is basically nothing but digitalization of existing cash. Subsequently, with the advantages of DLT built in, that is the blockchain technology which is there, and subsequently, going parallelly are these two things. One is, of course, the what you call the stable coin or the stable, the Libra sort of alternatives that are there, which are close alternates for a regulatory environment, but without accountability, or rather with accountability with a certain association or a certain setup, and subsequently going into Bitcoin. I'm not I'm not very sure whether all this will take will be done in a short frame of time. But largely, I think all these four spaces will run parallelly, concurrently, to the advantage of each one of them. And subsequently, I would imagine the issue would always be driven politically rather than economically in many ways, because of the geopolitical issues that are there. So I will pause here, and then we can have a better discussion later.
Yeah, right. And the last point that you made would be an interesting point to take up with Dr. K.P. Krishnan. Is it, from a government point of view, ultimately they're the ones who bell the cat, they're the ones who regulate and monitor a system. Is a digital currency seen purely as a threat, or is there another point of view that is there? Is it one where there is a great amount of insecurity about letting go of controls and the ability to control an economy? Would that be the prime concern when it comes to it, or is there another point of view, sir? That question as you lay out your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Veera. Let me again thank Synergia for this opportunity. In my initial remarks, let me very narrowly focus on those 4 questions that you've circulated. They are very thoughtful questions, and I hope to answer the last question that you posed in the process of answering those 4 questions. Question 1, COVID-19 and digital money. I personally don't believe there's any serious connection between digital currency and COVID-19. COVID-19 is a public health emergency. It, among other things, one of the public policy responses was a lockdown, and a lockdown of the kind that we saw in India and elsewhere clearly leads to a reduction of economic activity. I don't believe absence of digital money makes a difference to the level of economic activity, or could have led to an avoidance of lockdown. So I'm on this very limited point of COVID-19 and digital currency. And remember here, Amazon Pay or Alipay are not digital money. They digitize transactions, and I think Sriram pointed this out in his remarks also, with settlement essentially in fiat money. So I think for purposes of clarity, we need to keep in mind the distinction between digital transaction and digital money. They're completely different things, and almost everything can be virtually settled with fiat money. Now, the second question, which you had posed as part of the sort of guidance for us, the road ahead, what do I see as the different sort of roles of governments and markets? And in the process, I'll also briefly touch upon the question that you posed. Clearly, I think both have a role. Markets have a role and governments have a role. But I think disproportionately, government and public policy will sort of impact the way this evolves. Government, remember, formally can make all transactions which use other than fiat money as illegal, and many governments have done this. Now, it's also equally important to remember that in all societies, including ours, limited amounts of private money have existed and will continue to exist. Now, whether they are digital or otherwise, this amount of minimal amount of private money existence is a fact of life, and I believe this will continue. But if this reaches a stage where this begins to undermine, I repeat, when this reaches a stage when this begins to undermine fiat money, governments can and will surely act. And I think it's not only government of India, but governments all over the world will act. But I think apart from the government acting, remember, fundamentally what drives fiat money is acceptance of the currency by the bulk of the population. So if that acceptance of fiat money itself becomes a question mark, then we are in a very different situation where actions of governments, etc., I think will become secondary because there are more fundamental issues to deal with. But on this limited question, governments have two reasons. A, there is this large question of seigniorage, and it's an enormous amount of money. For those who are following this question in India, remember only last week, the Reserve Bank of India transferred something of the order of 55,000 crores as dividend to government, and a bulk of this dividend income comes from seigniorage, and seigniorage is an important part of all governments, and therefore all fiat money related questions will need to keep this in mind. Very quickly moving on to time frame, I think it's difficult, but purely on the digital currency front, remember the early Satoshi paper, now it is being discovered, had some flaws. For instance, the excessive energy consumption in Bitcoin has something which is, people are now working on it. Many engineering improvements are underway. So I think the field itself is in ferment. But true fiat money, and I keep repeating this point, true fiat or true private money as distinct from digital versions of fiat money are sort of unlikely to go away. Right. True fiat money is unlikely to go away unless governments, as we know it, are going away. I don't see that as very likely. And to the last question on fundamentals of monetary policy, I think in the light of all that I have said, keep in mind the fact that trust in currency is at the heart of all of the actions of the central bank.
Correct.
In that sort of context in India, we've actually had some very interesting developments. The inflation targeting arrangement to which the Reserve Bank of India and the Government of India formally committed themselves, initially by an agreement, subsequently by a change in the legislation in 2015, has actually, I think, made significant difference. India has consistently reported a reduction in inflation and a control on consumer price index inflation, which is not something common in India in the historical past. So if anything, actions of the public authorities in India, the Reserve Bank and the government, have actually increased the confidence in currency. So if you are talking about fiat money going away and implications for monetary policy from digital currency, in the current India, I don't see that as a very relevant question. However, and with this I will conclude, Veera, digitization or digitalization will seriously challenge traditional structures. Michael touched upon it, Sriram elaborated on it in the Indian context, but digitization of the economy, digitization of transactions in the financial space will seriously challenge traditional structures. Absolutely no disputes on that. But will this necessarily lead to undermining of monetary policy or reduction of central bank? I think on the contrary, the world seems to be discovering more and newer functions for central banking. So I don't see the implication as necessarily being a reduced importance of central banks. I'll conclude here. Thanks.
Right. Very, very interesting on how you believe that the more digitization that is happening, the greater is the focus on central banks. But I want to take this question and one observation that you made, Mr. Krishna, to Mr. Casey. Michael, Mr. Krishnan points out that the idea of currency will go away only when the idea of government as it exists today might go away. Would you A, agree with that? And two, you in your concluding remarks brought about the right to privacy and that is a very important issue in determining the road ahead for digital currencies. We are also at the same time seeing a great depleting amount of trust in governments as well. Would on the contrary, would that also push forward to a digital currency? I just want to get your views on the thoughts that have been raised by Mr. Krishnan and Mr. Sriram.
Yes, thank you, Veera, and thank you both to Mr. Krishnan and Mr. Sriram for some fascinating and erudite observations there. Look, I think this is the core question, because money and the sovereign, money and government have been intrinsically linked for millennia. And there's a good reason for that, right? It's because the government is the embodiment of the system around which the community that transacts with itself is represented. And it sets the laws, it sets the rules. And in fact, there's a lot of interest in modern monetary theory at the moment that posits that, it changes the way we should think about the issuance of money. And it starts with the very premise that the purpose of taxation is not to actually raise funds for the purposes of then distributing it as that expenditure, but as a mechanism for essentially creating a compulsion for community members to actually use the currency that's issued by that sovereign, right? So that relationship is very, very tightly bound, and I am very, very respectful of that. What matters, though, is that the digital global economy is a dramatically changing thing. Mark Andreessen tells us that software is eating the world, and I would argue that as much as it is the biggest battle of all, and it will take a long time, and it will be very, very complicated. The very power of the nation state is whittled away by this. It is challenged by this, and it starts to diminish. So the question really then becomes is, how do you define the community of transactors and what their interests are? Is it one that is it only Indians? Or is it another community of people participating in a supply chain? Is it people who care about some other social issue? And digital technologies and online communities enable this to happen. So then it becomes a question of, all right, what is is there a compulsion for me, rather than for paying my taxes, to use another type of currency because this community is preferencing that particular use? One of the concerns about Libra is that it does give an enormous amount of power to companies like Facebook, because Facebook could essentially, without making it a law, indirectly compel people to use that currency because there is an existing network of community. Facebook has been, I think Zuckerberg himself, quipped that it was like a nation, right? So there's this 2 billion users of Facebook who feel compelled to communicate and talk and exchange ideas with each other. And now the currency they have to use in that context could be the Libra. So this role of the state is therefore diminished because the capacity to compel, the idea of creating what is legal tender and what not, diminishes when there is an existing kind of economy within a digital realm. This is really the nub of the issue. Now, the state has power. It still has laws. It can shut Facebook down, but it can't shut Bitcoin down. And this is really critical. A decentralized community, one that doesn't have somebody that you can subpoena, a CEO that you can throw in jail, that is very, very difficult for the government to control. So then the question becomes, how, will those communities create their own kind of rules and laws, whether they are, enforceable in a court or just the laws of that relationship, the sort of the protocol-based systems around which they operate that then lead them all to agree to use a particular currency. So there's a huge issue here. I mean, it is. I'm not trying to diminish this. I'm not trying to suggest that yes, we're just going to flip a switch and suddenly governments are going to go away when we use these currencies, because at the core question is literally the fulcrum of power itself. So I certainly defer to that concept that this is extremely difficult to challenge, but I would suggest that we are in an environment where technology is indeed challenging a lot of those political structures.
And at a fundamental level, what you're talking about is a community which is a guarantor for itself and something that can operate without a government, which at the moment operates as a guarantor. I think it's a very interesting point. But the other point that you were making in terms of, and I wanted to quickly get this point before we talk about the technological trust aspect as well, is that you are talking of a post-dollar economy and how China is building itself as a potential digital challenger to the dollar. So is your sense that you're going to look at the fall of a dollar but not a replacement by another national currency, whether it is Chinese, whether it is Russian? We're not looking at another national currency which will replace the dollar as the benchmark international currency. It could well be a digital currency. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I think it does speak to the other part of your question. I apologize for not hitting upon it, and that is that yes, there is, I think, a diminished amount of trust in the U.S. government, but I do also think that we've seen the Edelman barometer and a range of other metrics showing that there is significant diminishment of trust in government itself. So, which means that any of these would-be successes, it just isn't ready. I don't think with the euro crisis only a few years ago and inklings of it starting to appear again, that people think the euro is anything like what the United States was as it was emerging at the beginning of the 20th century as a power to replace Britain. And I don't think obviously the yen and for reasons I described, the renminbi as well. So in that environment with trust itself diminishing and the absence of a natural successor, we are going to go through this decentralizing process that the internet put us on well before Bitcoin even existed back in the 80s and 90s, and that process is going to push us towards these alternatives. So yes, I do think this is critical, and I do think, contrast to Mr. Krishnan, that COVID really does matter. I mean, it's not that yes, we would still have gone into lockdown whether money was there or not, but I think that the challenge that it has imposed, I suppose the sequence of events, the very fact that we have seen ourselves to be completely dependent upon the dollar in this environment. And this sense is really about strength proving its weakness. I mean, Mark Carney laid this out in his quite influential speech at Jackson Hole a year ago. The idea that the absolute dependence on the dollar is what creates so many problems for countries like India, for countries particularly in the developing world. And the COVID crisis has absolutely accentuated that. Countries like Nigeria, which are dollar dependent, are now desperately looking for ways to transact with each other. They need a medium of payment, but the dollar shortage that was sparked by the crisis led to big problems in these places. And they've therefore looked to things like Bitcoin as alternatives. We're seeing a huge pickup in cryptocurrency usage across much of the developing world, precisely because of the challenge in obtaining dollars, which they've tended to use. So, yeah there's a lot of forces at work.
Right, Mr. Krishnan, quick response to that. It's a very, it may be a very bold prediction at this stage, but it is something that seems to have substance in terms of how economies are reacting.
First, on the the larger question of digital currency in the form of, say, a Libra or something else replacing, say, fiat currency, I was quickly looking at what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels said. Ironically, they predict a stateless society as the form after socialism, where communities will replace the governments. Now, all you're giving it is a different name. What is a currency? Currency is something which, if I give Veera Raghav without knowing who Veera Raghav is accepted by Veera Raghav. So, anonymous order matching and exchange is facilitated by a currency. In the state of being that we are today, there is a third party which is credibly certifying that what Krishnan is offering to Veera Raghav is acceptable. Replace the state with Facebook, you just have a different name. So something which is guaranteed to be acceptable is what is currency. So I think we can keep playing around with this, but you will require a third party certifying whatever is the medium of exchange. You call it state, you call it Facebook, you call it a community, you call it an order of things, you will require a third party backing it. I think that's the limited point I'm making.
No, and I think that's very much in agreement with what Mr. Casey is making. He's just talking about the shift. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Casey.
I'm just going to say, I actually do agree. I think the word third party is an interesting one. I mean, in the crypto world, we tend to describe the third party as an entity, whether it's Facebook or a person or a government or a bank. I think it's quite possible in this construct to think of perhaps that third party in a much more amorphous sense as being, if you like, the community that runs the protocol or that maintains that protocol. And the decentralized structure of that is what gives it its authority. But you're absolutely right, Mr. Krishnan, you do need that certification. It's just that in a Bitcoin world, it is happening by a protocol that is essentially living on its own with support of that, otherwise largely unidentifiable community. That's the key difference here.
Right.
If I can quickly come in, Veera?
Yeah, please go ahead. Quick.
See, again, the whole thing is a matter of trust. When you're talking about 130 crore people in India, do you think they are going to trust a machine and an algorithm? I suspect that phenomenon is at least decades away, if not more. So question of trust is central to currency and governance, and I think that's the key point.
That's the point, and I'd like to take that to the man dealing in an industry which is based on trust, which is banking, Mr. Sriram. But may I also point out, Mr. Krishnan, that the point is that the trust in the system and the traditional banking system has also been plummeting down. Trust in the sovereign across the world in terms of faith in the sovereign has also been plummeting down. While it may not, the question is that whether it's reached a threshold where it can push the other kind of trust. Mr. Sriram, would you just like to weigh in on the trust factor here?
Yeah, so the issue is in terms of managing a certain crisis, there could be different opinions. But in terms of trust in issuance and managing currency, I don't think there is any trust deficit there. And that is where the cloak of comfort comes in, in terms of as Dr. Krishnan said, 130 crore. For example, if you just shift the way we do banking from a fixed rate deposit to a floating rate deposit. Now, to explain this feature to 130 crore Indians is a massive comfort issue, in the sense that they are all, for years together, they believe that if there is a 5% fixed deposit interest, they will get 5% for the tenor of the loan or the deposit. So the problem is that, the financial literacy that is very weak, number one. The cloak of comfort that a central bank or a trusting authority gives is another thing. You see, and the third is, of course, the issue is always whether you're throwing the bathwater in the tub. If there is a problem today, because of whatever is the reason, are you, looking at that problem and trying to solve it, or are you just going into a deeper problem without knowing the implications of what is going to happen there? So there is where is the issue. And for medium of exchange, in terms of shifting it from a central bank, from currency to central bank tokens to Libra coins or whatever it is, I think these are all, in any which way, they're all different in terms of linking it to a certain currency. Right. But what is phenomenally different in what we are talking today is that we are trying to replace the physicality of a currency. If I hold 2,000 rupees in my hand, I know that I will be able to purchase goods and services worth 2,000 at whatever time. But in terms of figuring out how much tokens do I have and all that sort of financial literacy is going to be some time away. And that sort of trust building in a community to try and organize that trust for the community at large is going to be a very big challenge. It may come over time, I don't know, at least not in the near future.
Right, so there are practical challenges, and I just want to shift focus quickly to a quick point from Mr. Casey before I involve Major General Chandy and Toby Simon as well into this conversation. Is it a question of a crisis again? I mean, as long as there is trust in banks and the system, you're not going to shift forward. But could a disrupting event, one where there is which reduces the trust in the financial system or the banks, or where there is a collapse of economic conditions around the world, like you've seen in some countries, could that bolster the move towards a cryptocurrency? And is that where your fundamental argument comes in, that COVID as a disruptor pushed it forward in terms of movement towards a cryptocurrency?
Yes, and I agree with both gentlemen that trust is fundamental, and I also believe that the idea of trusting an algorithm is something that is a huge leap for many people. But at the margins, and I would say the first actors here, sadly, are going to be the wealthy and the digital literate. And so the biggest concern, I'm very glad that Mr. Sriram has focused a lot on financial inclusion in this challenge, because ultimately, yes, the trust is going to be greater amongst those who don't understand this in the old system, but those who ultimately have lost their trust in the old system and then migrate to a new form of money, I think in this programmable money environment are going to get yet even greater advantages from that, and ultimately the digital divide is going to get worse. And so we need to grapple with that problem, not only of yes, the trust problem, because that's the barrier we have to get over, but there's an educational component to this. And I do think the crisis is absolutely critical on this. There's no doubt, in my mind at least, that the fact that gold is now trading at record highs, the fact that Bitcoin has charted that, the fact that companies like MicroStrategy are now literally moving all of their reserve management holdings from cash into Bitcoin. And you've got guys like George Ball and Paul Tudor Jones and these legendary investors in the United States talking about Bitcoin as something that they are now going to trust, because they're very, very worried about this huge rollout of monetary issuance and quantitative easing. I think is a turning point. And you know, that's not going to be, you just can't stuff that genie back into the bottle. So there's definitely a trust problem, and I think it's definitely precipitated, or at least accelerated.
And since you raised that, may I just ask a very quick question to you? Where is the trust problem bigger? Is it trust in the technology itself, or is it trust in the one who is controlling that technology? Let's say if one of these governments or a country turns around and tends to guarantee, as you're pointing out, if let us say XYZ, I don't want to take one particular country's name, but if one guarantees it, will it go ahead, or is it really the core trust in the technology itself, and has the technology evolved to a level where it can be trusted?
It's a really difficult question. I'm not sure how, it's a hard one to untangle, because I think ultimately the choice of a particular currency, albeit completely and utterly, again, I agree with both gentlemen, it is dependent upon trust, nonetheless becomes a kind of automatic cultural thing. I don't really sit there and think and look as I hold a dollar in my hand, do I trust this? Am I more or less in trust? I'm just treating it as something that contains that value because it collectively almost embodies the entire community's trust in it. So that's the way it works. But then the thing is, people can be very, creative when faced with a need. I lived in Argentina for a number of years, and when they went through the crisis there in 2003, there were all these barter systems that would emerge. There were all sorts of alternative forms of currency that were being created. The colonial settlers in the United States used wampum. I mean, prisoners used cigarettes. I mean, there's ways in which, faced with a crisis, people, they need to transact. The most important thing is people want to be able to transact. And yes, have a store of value. But for the most part, I think the store of value is a secondary result of the need to transact. That in fact, under an algorithmic controlled system, may be possible to engineer without needing that store of value. That in fact, there is a mechanism for actually sort of protecting the transaction rather than the store being the money. That's a whole other conversation. But ultimately, I do think that things can happen faster than we think, because people move beyond this. They will gravitate to what works. And if there is a solution and there's no other solution, they'll just use what they can.
Right. I think it's the time to bring in Major General Chandy as well, who understands digital currencies and has written about it as well. Mr. General Chandy, go ahead with your observations or perhaps a question to the panel, sir. You need to unmute yourself, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good evening, gentlemen. At the outset, let me thank you three gentlemen for an excellent perspective, and I feel much richer after hearing these three very diverse perspectives. A measure of your success is that I actually have three questions, but I'm sure Veera's not going to give me time to ask more than one. So let me start with one, and if Veera does find time, I'll try and bring in a second. Now, my first question, I'm going to start by asking a question which I'll try and answer myself. Does the world have a stable international monetary system? And I think the answer is no. The Bretton Woods Agreement collapsed in 1971 when President Nixon removed away the gold standard from the dollar. But be that as it may, we, either as Americans or Indians, we belong to countries which have a stable sovereign currency. How does it feel if we were from a country which did not have a stable currency? Now, being an army officer, I've been privileged to serve in some of the troubled spots of the world. And in 1993, I served in Cambodia. Cambodia had a very serious mine problem. And as part of the United Nations Transition Authority there, I was serving there. And I saw a currency collapsing. And it was really something which was quite unbelievable. When we reached Cambodia, the exchange rate was 350 real to a US dollar. But as the UN picked up and as the elections took place, it became 3,500 real to a dollar. Right. And the absurd situation was that I had to hire D-miners, Khmer D-miners, demobilized soldiers. And I paid them $170 a month. And one day I was having a party with a Khmer army commander. That's a 3-star or a 4-star general, a very senior person. And after a few drinks, he asked me, he says, just tell me, how much do you pay the soldiers I give you? So I told him I pay them $170 a month. And then, he grumbled, and through his translator, he told me, he says that he receives the equivalent of $14 a month. And what I didn't tell them was that as an international staff, I was earning $170 a day. So you see that, when the currency collapses, it becomes so absurd. And though we are in India and in the US, we don't see it. But that's happening in Lebanon. And it's happening in Venezuela today as we speak. So my first question is, do you think that if we have a sovereign currency, if we have an international currency, can we avoid such crises in parts of the world to which we don't belong? Thank you.
Right, a question, answer, and a question to the panel. Who wants to take that? Very quick responses from Mr. Krishnan and then Mr. Casey.
No.
That was a very quick response. No, it doesn't work. Do you want to elaborate briefly on that response? Very briefly.
Yeah, currencies, we, for instance, discovered during the entire European community debate and a whole lot of other debates, what constitutes the appropriate union for a currency is not an objective, straightforward economic question. It's political, social, cultural. So to get India together as a country is the sort of the underlying challenge on which the currency is an overlay. Now, if you remember, to go back to the excellent example that General Saab gave, during the peak of the insurgency, Indian currency would not be acceptable in the insurgency-dominated states. So the question of currency is deeply embedded inside the question of sovereignty, which is a political, cultural, social question. And hence, the world will not have an international currency. Very briefly, very crudely, that's my answer.
Right. Let me just get the other theoretical view, at least, Mr. Casey. International currency, will it prevent volatility? Very brief answer. Would that be the response to volatility? Maybe not in a country like in India, but in countries where currencies are failing and are threatening to fail. There are several countries where you never know when it's going to fail. So is that a security?
Look, if you could engineer a system like that and you had this international standard, then yes, I think that it would. You would remove that dependency. But I agree entirely with Mr. Krishnan. You cannot separate that concept of the currency from the political and social structure, and we do not have an international system that has that. You'd have to ask the question in reverse. Can we build an international system in which everybody has buy-in? And if we did, then yes, we could have a currency. So I think that's the core point here. But
Right.
ultimately, the international, I do agree, the international monetary system is broken. It is definitely adding to instability, particularly in developing countries.
And as a banker, Mr. Sriram, is there a possibility that a bank might enter the currency business as well? I mean, is that a possibility in the long drawn future that bankers are looking at?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been very clearly enunciated by Dr. Krishnan. See, that is why we work on reserve currency, we work on exchange rates, we work on other economic indicators and parameters to give a sort of arrive at a certain alignment between various currencies and so on.
Right.
Currency is inherent to a particular country at the moment, and that is based on so many factors that I think Dr. Krishnan has said.
Correct.
So I can't see, what Major Saab is saying. I can't see it at least in the future, at least to my
Foreseeable future.
Yes.
As much as we can foresee. Toby, Simon, do you want to weigh in with your thoughts on it before I get final comments from the guests? Toby, you need to unmute yourself.
I just like to make a 30-second observation that trade and governance are going to be quintessentially coupled, and there's no way you can break them. And you're finding increasingly that the pressure on one is affecting the other. And my sense is if we don't have or improve governance in all societies, wherever we are, the onus to move to alternate forms of living our lives, I will put it that way, will be more. I don't want to be supervised. I don't want to be checked. I don't believe that the taxes that I am paying is utilized well. So then I would probably look for opportunities where I can. I feel that I'm probably even the whole question of being a citizen, even that will be redefined. Just because we are born in one part of the world doesn't mean that in the future that we will remain citizens. We might become part of a global community that has shared interest. And social media, and my sense is social media and all these digital platforms like digital currency will facilitate it. And instances like COVID is a big trigger. And this is what I feel what Michael said is true. It might not be the end of everything, but it is a big trigger for people to begin to rethink about it.
Right. It reminds us that we never know what we can predict, not just for the foreseeable future, but tomorrow. Who's going to get locked down and who's not? Well, I want to get final comments from the panelists and very brief ones, starting with Michael Casey. Are there 2 or 3 indicators that you would see over the next, let's say, a few years, which you believe would determine decisively the move that you predict will happen in the world? In the order as we started, from first Mr. Casey, Mr. Sriram, and then Mr. Krishnan.
Watch what China is doing. See how the evolution of the not just the DCEP, but also the integration of it into its various other blockchain and smart city projects goes along. Watch the price of gold and the price of Bitcoin. And see what that tells us about the evolving nature of trust in the system. I think those are really 2 very, very important factors to watch right now to see how everything evolves.
Mr. Sriram?
So largely, I think the facilitating factors I'd already mentioned in my opening remarks, and I think they remain such. But what I still feel is that digitalization and using digital means of exchange and other things will surely pick up. But digital currency is some way away. And I'm not very sure, because one of the things that we left out was the legal implications and legal problems that face any sort of contracts and so on. The whole legal system has been drawn for years and years and decades. I'm not very sure as to how it will stand in any digital currency concept. So I still feel digitalization in the digital economy using digital products will be there. Central bank will play an increasing role. I would imagine still that blockchain would be far more preferred than Bitcoin. And I think that is my reading of the current situation.
Right, interesting. Final thoughts from you, Mr. Krishnan. Quick comments on what you think the road ahead will be.
Thanks, Veer Raghav. I started, remember, with COVID. Let me end with COVID. What is the one underlying major problem of COVID when it comes to transactions? When I, let's say, meet Toby Simon in the Bangalore club, what am I most worried about? Is he going to transmit COVID to me because I do not know his actual health status? We give this a fancy name in public economics. It's called information asymmetry. I need some credible third-party certification that Toby is safe. Now, who can transmit that information to me that I will believe in? I think this is the heart of a lot of human interactions. So give it whatever name, third-party credible certification of information of all kinds will be necessary. We need to solve that problem. Thank you.
Right, thanks so much. All I can tell you is that I can give you a guarantee and I can be the third party to assure you that Toby Simon is safe and very well and having this conversation, and you will get to see him in Bangalore Club very shortly. I hope you enjoy your time. Thank you all, gentlemen, and I wanted to just tell Mr. Michael Casey that any conversation that starts in the US these days ends in China. That's the same thing that we've seen of digital currency. Thank you so much, Major General Chandy, for weighing in with your thoughts. I'm sorry, but we've run out of time for your other two questions. Maybe we can put that to the guests after this conversation's over. Thank you, Toby Simon, for joining us, Mr. Krishnan, Mr. Sriram, and as well as Michael Casey, and as well to all our viewers who tuned in on our website for this program. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.